when you talk about it, which you do extremely eloquently, what would you say?
I think it might be worth giving a bit of wider context. I made a programme for the BBC, a little documentary back in 2017, and got to speak as part of that to quite a few of the big players. So in particular, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Richard Branson, and also a lot of smaller startup companies on the west coast of America. And it was interesting because it felt to me almost like a gold rush at the time. And although it isn't too long ago, a lot has happened since 2017. But it's interesting, Jeff Bezos said to me that in order to build his company, Amazon, then he needed 2 pre-existing pieces of infrastructure which were publicly funded, which were the postal service and the internet. And so he said, given those, then I was able to build my company. And I want to do the same for entrepreneurs in the future in space. And so the infrastructure, the on-orbit infrastructure, launch services and so on. And what I found interesting was that they both mentioned, Elon, by the way, I interviewed him, but he wouldn't be filmed or recorded. So it wasn't a lot of use for a TV show, but we had an interesting conversation. And they both mentioned that they've been inspired by so 2 texts, really. There's a classic book from 1976 by O'Neill called The High Frontier, and they both mentioned it. And in that book, I thought I'd read you a quote from it at the end, because O'Neill says, why do we want to go to this frontier? And he said that there's reason to hope that the opening of a new high frontier will challenge the best that is in us, that the new lands waiting to be built in space will give us new freedom to search for better government, social systems and ways of life, and that our children may thereby find a world richer in opportunity by our efforts during the decades ahead. It was 1976. Oh. And they both, to understand, I think, what's happening, particularly in the US, but around the world, it's good to understand where the inspiration came from. There's another someone I met as part of that program was Robert Zubrin, and Zubrin is often credited as convincing Elon Musk that he should go into the space business. And Zubrin is very forthright, and he's very kind of frontier mentality, but he's written widely. But he said to me, and there's a quote from his book, but he said it almost verbatim, so he fixes you in the eye, and he said, "The worst idea there has ever been is that the total amount of potential resource is fixed. It is a catastrophic idea because it sets all against all." So he goes on, his position is that almost the cause of most, if not all, conflicts historically has been this idea that resources are limited. And of course, we're well aware of that now. It's putting pressure on the Earth's climate and the Earth's ecosystem and so on. So resources are limited on the Earth. But so he and O'Neill, and I think by extension a lot of the entrepreneurs who are in this business, feel very strongly that this is the way that we expand our civilization, whilst, and Jeff Bezos always emphasizes this, whilst protecting the Earth, because the Earth is, in Bezos's words, the best planet in the universe for us, which of course self-evidently it is, because we evolved on it. And so I think that context for me is important, because it's the kind of the inspirational context. But then of course we could look at the more, I was going to say more down to earth part, but I'm sure throughout this inquiry that you'll talk about the economics. But it's worth just reflecting on that. There's a McKinsey report that came out April 2024, I think. It's called Space, the $1.8 trillion opportunity for global economic growth. So that's just it's relatively reasonable, slightly conservative perhaps report, but claiming that by 2035, the space economy will be worth something like $2 trillion. So you're looking at somewhere like a 9 or 10% growth year on year from now. And so I suppose to the skeptic, you could point out that we're talking about one of, if not the highest growth areas in the world economy. And also, it's worth pointing out that many people I've spoken to in this business in a way, object to us splitting the economy into the space economy and the Earth economy, because it is, of course, the economy. It's part of our economy, a big part of our economy. I mean, to focus on the UK, I think the figure is something like 18% of our GDP at the moment relies in some way on space, whether it be communications, Earth observation, GPS, and so on. So it's already, I think, a vital part of our economy. But I do go back, I think, when we look into the 10-year horizon, the 20-year horizons, I'm sure we'll speak about, the opportunities become more O'Neill and Zubrin as we go forward in time, and less just about economic growth, I think.
Fantastic, thank you. Baroness Donahue.
Hello, Professor Cox. Thank you very much for being here. You have argued in the past that governments don't invest enough in the UK. Do you think that's still the case? And if so, have you got a view about what percentage of a GDP we should be spending on it?
Yes, thank you. The answer is yes. Just if you look at the numbers, I mean, UK at the moment spends something like 0.05% of GDP on space. For comparison, the US is about 0.25%. So we're low. We're significantly below France, for example, and Italy. When you put that in the context of what I just said about this is probably the fastest growing area in the world economy, arguably, or at least alongside things like AI. It's one of the key growth areas. Then I think you would argue that 0.05% is low, especially because, again, if you look at the numbers, at the moment, space sector, something like 18 billion it's worth in the UK, 50,000 high-value jobs. So for that very small investment, we get a great deal back. But of course, I suppose we'll talk about this later, you could then look at where you would increase that investment. But it seems just on the basic number that we are below many of our major competitors, and way below as a percentage of GDP countries like France, Germany, US. Then I think it's clear that there's room for greater investment.
Thank you. Lord Tarasenko.
Thank you very much. It's a related question, really. Representing universities, being a professor in a university which has a fair amount of space research, located not far from Harwell and Cullum, I have a specific interest in the university's strength in space, and I want to salute you, I think, as still being an active professor at the University of Manchester. I have a minor conflict of interest to declare to the rest of the committee in that my daughter did study physics at the University of Manchester and attended one of Professor Cox's lectures to the first years in 2010. So I'm inherently positively biased towards our witness today.
She's still a physicist, but
no, she works for different industries. She works for the animation industry and Aardman. So she made a transition towards the creative industries, having started out in physics. But we believe in this country that our universities are world leading in the fields of space manufacturing and space science. The evidence is that the last time we looked, which is about 2021, we had 53 UK universities with active space science research interests, 2,000 or so university-based researchers. You mentioned the last time you were in front of a committee, I think it was the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee 9 years ago, 2015, saying that UK just about retained its position as one of the world's leading research bases, in that case for science and technology, but specifically for space technology or space manufacturing, space science, space technologies. Where do you think we are, given that you've highlighted already our investment is lower than other European countries such as France and Italy? We're obviously punching above our weight, but is it enough what we're investing is specifically into the university sector, supporting university research in space?
I think it's a really it's a central question, because when we look at the opportunities that we have spoken about and are going to speak about, I see the UK PLC, if you like, as it's an ecosystem, and as you said, there are world-leading parts of that ecosystem, or at least highly competitive, let's say. And the universities sector, I think, is it's a necessary but not sufficient pillar. It's part of the foundation of this success. Without it, you can't do it. And as I think I probably said in 2015, but it's worth repeating, that a university sector like ours is easy to damage, but almost impossible to build from scratch. I mean, of course, countries like China are trying, but it's a tremendous investment. So it's extremely valuable and necessary. And so we are, if you look at the way the collaboration works, I mean, I could list, I've got a lot of examples here, but the James Webb Space Telescope is an important one. So that's obviously one of the world's leading instruments at the moment, tremendously exciting. We can talk about the science if you've got time, but one of the things that we did, there are 4 main instruments on it, and we led one of them. And it was a consortium, and it's one of the infrared camera instruments. It was led by, it was actually, was it Glasgow? Let me just check. It was, I don't want to get that wrong. It was STFC, RAL, Airbus, Leicester, Cardiff. So you see that the key point is that you've got the funding agency, you've got an industry partner, in this case Airbus, and then you have a list of universities that lead the construction. So they're an integral part of it. And as you mentioned, the university sector is under pressure at the moment, and maybe it's not the right place to go into the pressures, but even if you look at research, the estimate from Universities UK is that we have something like a 5 billion deficit on the research spend, and part of that comes from the full economic costing model and so on. Of course, we have deficits as well in teaching. Those are made up in large part by international students. That's under pressure as well, so we could talk about that in some detail. But I think the key point is that everything we talk about today, that the way our ecosystem in space works, is a collaboration between our industry, our academic sector, and the national laboratories, the funding agencies. And as you said, it's extremely successful, but it's under pressure. And so I think one of that to me, that would be the key message, that I think there are several pillars here that are all necessary but not sufficient. And if you damage one, the whole edifice can collapse.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lord Boothsmith?
The question that I had, and thank you for coming today, is taking all of that you've just said and thinking a little bit more about sort of the specific context of the UK market right now and how it interplays globally. What do you think are sort of structural comparative advantages are versus other similar nations?
I think, as I've said, I think that our very broad and deep research sector is one of them. But I think if you look at our industrial capacity, so I mean, an example of an extremely successful company, for example, would be Ceres Satellites, which very famously grew as a spin-out initially from a university, which is extremely important. That tends to be where these innovative companies come from, but is now definitely world-leading in the construction of lower mass satellites. But also, if you look at the big programs, it played a central role in Galileo, for example, which is an extremely large European program. So I think, I mean, I could list the sector. I think the point is the sector is broad and deep, and we have I think if you look at, for example, another example would be our imaging technology. So there was E2V, which were recently taken over by an American company, but still, they manufactured the sensors, the optical sensors, for almost everything you could list. So the Kepler Space Telescope, Hubble Space Telescope, telescope, the New Horizons mission. You could go on. It's almost a list of all the big successful space missions. Our technology companies have had a key role in many of them. So I think that would be the answer to your question.
I think I'm thinking more about the traditional things that I suppose the UK is a centre of. You may not know the answer to this question, but it's more about if you come across it. But thinking about things like insurance or finance or legal work, as a new frontier emerges, I would imagine that someone's going to try and create some sort of legal framework around it, and there's going to be insurance required in somewhere. So I was wondering if any of the companies that you've seen or any of the research you've seen where people are actually thinking about that, and if there's anything happening interesting in the UK in that space.
Yes, it's widely discussed. I mean, as you said, I think the UK insured the first communications satellite. It was 1965. It was Lloyd's, of course. So it's a key point. Professional services we're very good at, and several of the conferences I've attended over the last few years, they tend to be there was a conference I was at a few weeks ago in UAE, for example, which was discussing the framework, the legal frameworks, the regulatory frameworks, which must be developed as we begin to industrialise near-Earth space and onwards to the moon. Asteroid mining we'll probably talk about, and so on. It's interesting to me that a lot of countries, Luxembourg is another one who's always been very big in this area, a lot of countries see that even if they can't contribute technologically, although many have the ambition to, they can contribute in this the regulatory regimes which are very old-fashioned at the moment. We're talking about the treaties that were put in place in the Apollo era, really. And when you come to mining, and you come to mineral rights, and you come to space debris management, for example, I know UK Space Agency are particularly interested in a role in developing that. An example would be, for example, let's say a satellite you lose contact with a satellite in this increasingly congested environment, and then there's a possibility it will come into conflict with one of your satellites. What do you do? Who do you have to talk to? The country that launched the satellite? Do you have the right to move it? Could it be considered to be an aggressive act if you move someone's satellite, even if it's not functional and threatening one of your pieces of infrastructure, and so on? Those frameworks don't exist. And so I agree with you that putting the technology aside and the academic work aside, our long history in services, legal services and so on, I think we could play a vital role in that, absolutely.
Very quickly, coming back to the technology, you mentioned, satellite technology. What most people don't realize, they've been around 40 years, and Elon Musk got a board seat from investing 10% in 2005. Now, it may be an unfair question, but in your view, why we ended up with SpaceX and Starlink and satellite technologies that was the world leader then, just 20 years ago, being effectively acquired by Airbus, but at a much lower scale than what's happened since with SpaceX, Starlink. Any reasons? Anything that we missed doing? Did we not invest enough? Why is it that Elon Musk was actually, talking to Surrey about understanding what they were doing, and is now in the lead by several orders of magnitude?
I mean, it's a question that's asked often, isn't it? About it's translation. It's one of the UK's oldest problems, isn't it? The translation of our expertise into major industrial and economic success. So I don't know. I think you're asking a question that gets asked all the time about the UK economy, and I'm not an expert in that field.
I just wondered if there was any space implications for that. You're absolutely right. It's a question that's asked in multiple domains, but there may be different issues in different domains. Was there a lack of investment in supporting such a company 20 years ago? It's an amazing story, but it's a company that's actually quite mature, 40 years old.
Yeah. It's as I said, even closer. So it was one of the major players in Galileo, for example, which is the European global positioning system, which it's now lost as well. So that was for a different reason. That was Brexit related. So I suppose I don't know is the answer, whether we can say, well, if it had only had more support, then it would have. But, I mean, you could argue, I suppose, that if there had been some kind of European program to develop something like Starlink, then it would have been well placed to play a major role in it. So maybe that's an answer. But then that goes, but I'm sure we'll talk about that. It goes back to what role we can play in the future in being in the decision-making process when these collaborations, or even be in a position to initiate such collaborations, such as for systems such as Starlink.
Thank you.
Baroness Verbaar.
Thank you. Professor Cox, you've already mentioned that we have considerable strength in satellite manufacture. And just to say that the city of Glasgow is the largest producer of satellites in Europe. But how do you envisage the space economy looking in the future? What do you consider to be the key emerging opportunities in space for the UK? And in that context, could you perhaps say something about the Moonlight Initiative?
So it's a remarkable fact, isn't it, that Glasgow is the largest manufacturer of satellites in Europe. I think we tend to forget how successful we are in those areas. Also, by the way, Glasgow in talking about future scientific missions. So one of the most exciting missions from my perspective is the LISA mission, which is a gravitational wave mission. So gravitational waves are the Nobel Prize was awarded a couple of years ago to Kip Thorne and others, but Glasgow have always been very strong in gravitational wave astronomy. It's used to detect, for example, the collisions of black holes. And you might say, why is that important and why is that interesting? Some of the research into black holes is leading us into insights and transferable skills, actually, which are being found to be extremely useful in quantum computing, which is probably a bit off-piste, but I could talk. It's a very strange connection that the study of black holes would be important potentially for understanding quantum computing. An example of serendipity in science. So just as an aside, LISA is one of the big missions, the big European space missions, which Glasgow has a big leading role in. In terms of, so your question was about in terms of economic opportunities.
Yes, how do you envisage future opportunities?
I mean, we could talk, for example, I mentioned right at the start about access to resources. So we're talking about mining there, asteroid mining. And I think most people you speak to would say that's a medium-term goal. Although it's worth reflecting on what's up there. If you look, for example, there's one asteroid, one of the near-Earth asteroids, which has more metal than the Earth in it. We're talking about reservoirs of iron, nickel, cobalt, gallium, platinum, a lot of the rare metals. And so the potential, I think, people are already talking about a $1 trillion industry in terms of asteroid mining. You could ask the question, well, how can we play a role in that? And it's a good question. Maybe that goes to, maybe I'm skipping forward a bit, but it goes, I think, forward to our questions about our collaborations. Who do we collaborate with to begin to play a role in those areas that sound like science fiction? And perhaps 10 years ago or 20 years ago were science fiction. But it's not a coincidence that a lot of startup companies in the US, for example, are now asteroid mining startups at the 10, 20, 30, $50 million level. A lot of venture capital going into those companies. So why? Because it's seen as a potential, well, not even a potential, it is a resource. The two things to say about it, though, is when you read into more detail, the shorter term, the nearer term goal, I think, in access to resources in space, is really building things in space. So there are two different sort of economic arguments you can have, or framings you can give resource access in space. One is, do we bring it back to Earth? And that's extremely expensive at the moment. And so most economic studies I've seen would say that it's further down the line that you start to go and mine rare metals and things on asteroids and bring them back for use on Earth. But initially, access to resources like water is central. It's been described as the basis of this economy that we're building in space. So the reason a lot of missions to the moon are concerned with surveying the moon, particularly looking for water at places like the South Pole, is that's the fundamental resource, first of all. So because when you have water, you have rocket fuel, you have oxygen, and so on. And so most of the studies I've seen that in the next 10 or 20 years are concerned with the technology to go and access resources that will then be used in space. And then further down the line, when it becomes economically feasible, begin to bring those resources back. So I hope that's an answer to your question. It's one of the, asteroid mining is one of the, I think.
And sorry, just service industries on the Moonlight Initiative, is there anything that you
Yes,
can...
service. I mean, that was, again, I mentioned right at the start the conversation I had with Jeff Bezos a while ago. And it's interesting that Blue Origin seemed to be quite heavily focused on in-orbit servicing, and then servicing from there onto the moon and to the asteroids and so on. So I think that development of the infrastructure, so we're talking then about servicing and refueling satellites, for example. It's worth pointing out or remembering that the Hubble Space Telescope would not be operational now if it wasn't designed for servicing by the space shuttle in that case. So I think that I got the sense that Blue Origin in particular were very focused on providing, as I mentioned, that infrastructure that entrepreneurs and industries can operate within and rely upon. So I think you're right, and it becomes interesting then of what role, I suppose in the context of this committee, and what role the UK could or should play in being a part of that infrastructure development. I know that I suppose you're going to have Tim Peake on the committee in a few months, aren't you, or a few weeks. I mean, I had a conversation with him, and he was interested in whether the UK plays a role in the construction of some of the space stations that are going to be part of that infrastructure. For example, could we begin to play a role in building modules for the space stations? We don't do that at the moment. That's not something that we're world leading at in the UK. But maybe it's something we want to look at. We want to look at whether the UK wants a part of that real estate in orbit. But I think, and again, I think the way that I think about it, I suppose it is, as Jeff Bezos said, it's the internet and the postal service of this new 21st century economy. How much do we want to be a part of the development and management, but as you said, in legal services, regulatory services, but also the physical construction of that infrastructure? I think that's a question that is an interesting question for me. And obviously, I think, given that I do think that over many decades, then because of the potential out there, I think that this is going to become not only one of the largest growth areas, which it already is, but it's going to become dominant at some point. The question of when it becomes dominant as part of the world economy is a good question, but it will. And so I think, for me, we have to be looking at playing a leading role in developing the framework within that part of our economy, the global economy, operates. It seems self-evident to me.
Thank you. Viscount Stansgate.
Professor Cox, between 1986 and 2009, it was the successive policy of UK governments not to invest taxpayers' money in human spaceflight, preferring instead to support robotic missions. Looking back, was that wise?
It's a very good question, and I think it depends through which lens you look at the decision, I think. Because you could argue that, so if you're talking about engaging the public in, which means, I suppose, having public support for investment of taxpayers' money in space, then it is true that robotic exploration is extremely successful. So Mars rovers, going back in time, things like Voyager, Hubble Space Telescope, although that relied on astronauts to service it. So, but it is also true that astronauts are tremendous ambassadors for the space industry, and we've seen that. We've had 2 high-profile astronauts, Helen Sharman and Tim Peake, and it's hard to argue that they have not been tremendously valuable for the UK. Not only in inspiration and education, but just that they're valuable ambassadors. So I think it clearly was a good investment. So I think going forward, it seems clear to me that you could argue that, so if you're arguing about exploration of the outer solar system, for example, to acquire knowledge, or the James Webb Space Telescope, that does not need astronauts to service, it's not designed for that. So purely scientifically, then you can make a strong argument that because it's so much cheaper, then in terms of exploration, then investment in robotic spaceflight is the way to go. But I think now we're talking about developing an economy in space, then I think that human presence is absolutely essential to that. So I think the answer to your question, for me, my personal view, is that the terms have changed. So I may well have been a supporter of the UK investing much more heavily in robotic exploration if you go back 20 years, because then we were talking about essentially science or communication satellites and so on, that kind of infrastructure. But now, when you talk about just the excitement, generating excitement in the UK space programme, but also the capability to do all the things that we're now talking about, these things that seem like science fiction 20 years ago but now aren't, I think that it's essential that we get back into the human spaceflight business. I think it'd be almost inconceivable for a country that aspires to play a leading role in this economy going forward to have no presence in human spaceflight.
Can I thank you not only for answering my question, but actually answering my follow-up question before I had a chance to put it, which is looking ahead and how we should balance the demands of what we've invested in so far. But I personally agree with you. I think the human element of spaceflight and the inspirational element is terribly important. So I won't take up the committee's time, but for the record, you will have answered both questions in one answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Baroness Stoll.
I thought I was question 7. Am I not?
Yeah, but Lord Tarasenko, I moved up.
Oh, has he done 6?
Yeah,
sorry, I do beg your pardon. Sorry.
I'm ahead of you for once.
Oh, sorry about that. Professor Cox, thank you very much for being here. I wanted to ask you about how you characterise the UK's commercial space sector. And in answering the question, I've been struck by a couple of things that you've said up to now in some of your answers. One was the comparison that you drew between the UK and France in terms of public sector investment, percentage of GDP, but also in answering my colleague Baroness Mubarak's question about what is already happening in terms of UK commercial sector. But I suppose in characterising sort of the commercial space sector, one of the things I'm sort of quite interested to understand is how much you see it relying on investment from the public sector. And I think if I sort of compare space to, say, AI, where the UK is behind France in terms of public sector investment, but the UK is ahead of France in terms of, you know, our position in the ecosystem. I just wonder if the same sort of applies, you know, in this context too. You know, as in, is that public sector level of investment driving our commercial position, or are the two sort of not necessarily connected, or is not as much as you might think they ought to be?
So I could perhaps answer by giving an example, which it was a few weeks ago actually. So I'm going to use the University of Manchester as an example just because I know it, right? But just to say, I'm not trying to single it out in a particular way. But I was there a few weeks ago, and they're looking at some of the spin-offs from the graphene discovery. And I'll make a couple of comments on that in a moment. But one of the spin-offs was a company, they're called Smart IR. So they're a small company, and they're in the graphene innovation centre that we've got there. So it's part of the university, really to house small spin-out companies for new materials research. And they've just, they're working on using graphene in thermal management of satellites. So and they just had a contract from the ESA Business Incubation Centre, which is that's partly funded by STFC, European Space Agency, Leicester University, UK Space Agency, and so on. So what I found interesting about that is it's a relatively small company at the moment, but if you think how it came to be, and it's growing fast, where did that capability come from? It came from, initially, of course, the discovery of graphene, which was Andrei Geim-Kostya Novoselov at the University of Manchester. It's also really important. Andrei, in his Nobel Prize speech, I remember it really vividly, he said that he discovered graphene in his playtime. He had playtime in the lab, Friday afternoons. And graphene was one of those so purely research, blue skies research discoveries, but has led to this multi-billion-dollar industry and capabilities worldwide, but also in Manchester that we're world leading in. And so that ecosystem, to be able to take those often curiosity-led academic discoveries and then be very smart about building them. Surrey Satellites is another example, by the way, is a spin-out from university, as I mentioned before. To be able to take that and translate it, I think, is one of our strengths, although, as we mentioned earlier, also it's been one of our failings. But at the small level, at the level of taking, in that case, a world-leading materials science, and it's undoubted that we're world-leading in materials science at places like Manchester and elsewhere, and then turning it into small companies initially that can do sort of address fundamental engineering challenges in space science, I think that's what we're extremely good at, I think, in the UK. Or at least we have this capability. And it goes back to what we spoke about earlier. It goes back to the capability that has been built up over hundreds of years in our university sector. But making sure we invest, to go to your question, making sure that those discoveries that we make, and we're very good at making them, get translated into small businesses initially, and then hopefully larger businesses. I think for me that's the key, and I think that's probably, I don't know, so I may be wrong here, but if I was to guess about why we punch above our weight, I would say that infrastructure that we have, that collaboration on university campuses and elsewhere is I think as good as I've seen anywhere personally outside of the US.
And do you think we're punching above our weight in a commercial sense if you compare sort of us to the same European countries that you highlighted before as being bigger public investors in this area?
Some of that question gets into a discussion about the an example would be the European Space Agency. So the European Space Agency, by design, you get out what you put in, right? But there's the Just Retour sort of framework. In terms of the science investment, the space science investment, we're high, as a percentage of that piece of ESA, because it's based on GDP. And so because we're one of the largest countries in terms of GDP, we invest a lot and we get a lot back. And that forms the basis of a lot of our space science. But in terms of the engineering, so we talked about Ariane. I don't know. That was before we went on air, maybe. But the Ariane, the European rocket project, for example, we don't invest in that. So we're extremely low investors outside of the space science area in the European Space Agency. So one of the reasons that I would say that we don't have a big base in terms of manufacturing, as we mentioned, modules for space stations, for example, in this country, is because we don't invest in that part of the European Space Agency. So that I think there are the different answers depending on which sector you're looking at. So we're very good in space science, and we get a lot in, get a lot back, but not so active in launch systems, for example, because we don't put anything in there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lord Clement Jones.
I think I, at this point, need to declare an interest as chair of the Governing Council of Queen Mary University, because this is, yes, another university question. And you've already unpacked quite a bit about the relationship between academic institutions and commercial space firms and so on, and emphasised the importance. But how, and perhaps the question is not how do they, but how can they do better, in a sense. I think you've already said that we do have, a lot of assets as a country in this respect. How could we do that better? I mean, in terms of particularly the spin-outs, setting up innovative space firms and so on. You've illustrated the graphene example as a really good case. I mean, are there others where we haven't been quite so successful, where if we'd had a different national policy or more ability to put resource into it, or a less risk-averse investment pipeline, what would your prescription be for not only bringing the universities closer together with commercial space firms, but also then having these successful spin-outs?
Well, it's not my area of expertise, but the Royal Society is in the process of preparing a report, which and they said they would make it as soon as it's published. They'll make it available to the committee. But in that report, I had sight of some of the research. And one of the key findings is stability of funding, in particular 10-year funding horizons, which I know has been discussed quite widely in government, because space missions take a long time to develop. And given that a country of the size of ours cannot go it alone in any area of space research, really, maybe in terms of small satellite constellations and so on, but broadly speaking, you can't. Then being a reliable partner becomes extremely valuable. And so very simple, or almost accounting changes, such as 10-year funding horizons, they don't require any more money. So they just require stability of funding. The Royal Society identified as one of the key things that we could do without requiring more resource in order to make us a more attractive partner. And there was an example, there was a moon mission, I can't remember, I could look it up, I can't remember which one it was, where we developed an instrument. It was quite a recent example, and it almost didn't get on the spacecraft because launch delays can push you outside of the funding envelope, and then you can end up having to return the money to the funding and so on. You know the problem. So that was one of them. The other findings, the key recommendations, which we've spoken about, were maintain a strong science and innovation ecosystem for space, and enhance sustainability and security of the space domain through effective governance. So we've talked about that as well. So those were the key findings of that report. But it would be worth. It's ready in a few months, I think. So it would be worth. That will be delivered to the committee. But I think, long-term funding stability which goes, we could talk about the relationship to ESA. I think
I just wondered, is there any country that does it in that way better, so to speak, that you know of?
I think it's not my area of expertise, so I don't know is the answer.
Thank you.
Lord Lansley.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Cox. Thank you very much for being with us. You said earlier we should return to the question of who do we collaborate with. So can I ask you about that, really? So firstly, in terms of our international partnerships, how might we, in your view, enhance where those are going in the future? But also, should we seek to develop partnerships that we don't presently enjoy?
It's a very so in the past we've I gave that list of missions that, for example, we've with our sensors, it's pretty much every mission you can list to Cassini, Hubble, James Webb Space Telescope. It's a list, New Horizons. So we do, because we're world leading in certain areas, we collaborate with NASA extremely successfully and the European Space Agency extremely successfully. For me, and I've seen it in other areas, in my area of research, particle physics, it's the same. The US is in a very valuable but difficult partner to base a strategy on, because the funding is unstable. Just because of the partnerships can be unstable, just because of the way that the funding works with Congress and so on. So you're vulnerable to political uncertainty. Whereas the difference to me between NASA and ESA is that if you're a major contributor to ESA, then you're part of the decision-making process. And the more you contribute, the more say you have in the decision-making process. And although, as I said, we contribute a lot to ESA's space times budget, I have the figures here. If you look at our contribution to ESA outside of that, it is extremely small. So the voluntary programs, if you like. Germany is the biggest. Germany, France, and Italy make up something like 50%, I think, of the funding, and we're a very small part of that. So when I look at that, to me, if you think about, and this is my personal opinion, if you think about how the UK can play a major role in this economy going forward, the most reliable partner I could see would be the European Space Agency, just by design. Because if let's say, for example, we were to up our funding to the level of France, Germany or Italy, you're at a level of between €500 million and €1 billion or something like that per year, less that we spend than those three. And so those three have the major say in the development of the policy and the return. As I mentioned, the system is, if you put the money in, you get the money back into your industry. So it's essentially an aerospace subsidy in any case. So it seems to me that although it's clear that we've been extremely successful and will continue to be, because we're excellent collaborating with not only NASA but countries like India, who have a big emerging space program, Japan, with big collaborators with, and so on. My view is, when you look at the gap in our influence in the decision-making process, then I would be looking at ESA, just purely because you have you have control over the decision-making process, which you don't have clearly with NASA.
I just 2 points out of that, if I may. One is just, sometimes we talk about interests here. My interest in this was over 40 years ago, when the decision was made, when I was the UK representative to ESA, was not to participate in Ariane, to get out a space transport system. It wasn't technically robotic missions instead of human missions. It was not in space transport systems. But the intention was to put a great deal more emphasis on Earth remote sensing and space telecommunications. So, and unless I'm very much mistaken, there was considerable economic benefit associated with that. So, for example,
it really worked.
Surrey satellites would be an example of the benefit from the participation that in LSAT that went into Galileo. But do we have the control that we used to have in the European Space Agency? Can we exploit that in the same way that we did? So let's take Galileo as an example. We were in Galileo, and as you rightly said, we're now not in Galileo because it has shifted to being governed essentially by the European Union's space programme rather than by the European Space Agency. How might we overcome those limitations on what we do in ESA?
Well, the colleagues I've spoken to who have worked within that framework at ESA point out, and I think it's probably kind of stating the obvious in a sense, but because we're a relatively low investor at the moment, then we don't have a terrific amount of say. But so I think it ultimately comes down, as with probably many things in Europe, it comes down to how big an investor you are. And that's central, I think, to the discussion that we're having. It's where, given that if we accept that this space is vitally important to the UK on virtually every level, economically, in defence terms, and so we have to be part of this. And the earlier that we're part of it, the more say we have, then the better we will be in 10 or 20 years' time. Then the question of where you can have influence, I think, becomes central. And to me, it seems that when you're talking about relatively small number, I should say, just for context, the budget of ESA is something like 5.5 billion or so, rising, I think, to 7 in a few years' time. So you're talking about a reasonably low budget. So it's a central question, isn't it? Who do you collaborate with? Is it the right decision to collaborate with, in a very successful way, with countries like the US and India and Japan and so on, where you will be a minor partner, certainly in decision making? Or do we aim to become a major partner in the decision making process going forward? That would be my ambition for the country. But then the question becomes, how do you do that? And I suppose it's arguable. It seems to me that ESA is a clear place that we could have. There's a clear path to increase influence in the decision-making process, because it really just depends on how much money you put in there. And if we put, just to pluck a number out of thin air, but looking at the numbers, if we put €1 billion a year into ESA, on top of what we're doing now, we'd be the number one funder.
And in which programmes would you prioritise that?
Well, then it becomes the question, I suppose, of which programmes do we want to push Europe towards in our interest. Ariane's an interesting one, actually. I had a conversation about it the other day, because you could argue that the technology is old-fashioned technology. Right? You could say, well, they're not reusable rockets. And you'd be right in some sense. It's not semi-reusable or fully reusable, which is where SpaceX are going and Blue Origin are going. However, it was pointed out to me that the James Webb Space Telescope was launched on an Ariane 5. Why was it launched on an Ariane 5? Because it was a tremendously reliable system. And for high-value payloads, then the rocket is a small amount. It's a small amount of money in the mission cost. And that launch was so successful, so precise, that it extended the lifetime of the telescope, because it got it into exactly the right place. Didn't need to use any fuel to adjust. It was positioned exactly where it should have been. So you can argue that Ariane, although it's not the latest reusable technology, is extremely good at some things, which is extremely reliable launch. So, but it's just it's a counter argument to the one that one might make that but I suppose going forward, I suppose Europe is going to want, I assume, a reusable launch capability. It has to. It seems to me. I mean, an example, by the way, of a failure, which an unfortunate failure, would be the ExoMars mission, where we have the mission, it's built, it's world leading. The drill system, for example, on ExoMars is significantly better than anything that's been launched to Mars. It didn't go because we were reliant on a Russian launch vehicle, so we missed the launch window. I think any way you look at it, it seems to me the question we could ask is, are we happy as a country in the current geopolitical environment, given that space is a key part of our economic and security future? Are we happy being entirely reliant on third-party launch providers? Or do we want to be part of the manufacture and decision-making process? That's central, I think. I mean, I know what my answer would be.
Thank you. Baroness von Carter.
Apologies, Professor Cox, for being a bit late, but I think my question, which I think is the final question, is it?
No, there's one.
There's one more. Okay, but it rather fits in with your first question, which was so wonderfully eloquent about the frontier. I mean, we have always explored, haven't we? And all the things you said sort of resonated with me. But my question is about whether we are branding the opportunities of space correctly. But can I just ask you as a prequel, because there's been lots of questions about universities, and I am quite interested, being someone who's very involved in the creative industries, about whether you think enough is done at school level to educate and inform and so on. Sorry, not talking about the BBC, but about what space, the opportunities that space offers. So if I could start with that, and then if you don't mind, I've got a supplementary. Yeah.
I think the answer to that question is no. I think in the Royal Society report that I mentioned earlier, I think the number was something like 50% of companies in this area are reporting that they have difficulty recruiting. So clearly, there's no doubt that if I go to give a talk, and Tim Peake would say the same, yes. Chris Hadfield would say the same, there's tremendous enthusiasm. So it is one of the drivers that drives people into careers in science and engineering. But transmitting, I think, to students that there's an actual possibility that they can personally be involved, and showing them the route and showing them the roadmap is the challenge. I mean, as an aside, I'm involved in a school with Lord Mawson, actually, called St Paul's Way in Tower Hamlets. And one of the things we found when we started working at that school 10 years ago was that although, of course, there's no shortage of ability and ambition, it was very difficult for a student at that school to see a route, let's say to university, but it could be to an engineering apprenticeship or whatever it is, because they tended to come from families where no one had done that. And so it's an enormous barrier if you don't know anyone who's been to a university. Let's say for a student at St Paul's Way to consider going to the University of Durham, for example, or Leicester, sort of one of the central space science universities. It's a long way to go if you have no experience of it. So, as an aside, I think the more effort we can put into tapping that talent, which is undoubtedly there, then the better we will be. It's kind of an obvious statement, but you can see a gap there. The gap is obvious because something like half the high-tech companies say that they have trouble recruiting. So we clearly need to do something about that. What was the second question?
Well, I haven't asked it yet, but it's just the breadth of, I think this actually picks up with what my neighbour here was saying, the breadth of understanding of what space exploration offers. It's not just being Tim Peake, much as we probably all like to be Tim Peake. except maybe for the motion sickness. But there hasn't been a very good spreading of what space exploration actually involves, and numbers of people that it needs, as it were.
Yeah, and I think it's going to come. If you look at some of the roadmaps for companies.
And you talked about modules. I was very interested by that we should be designing modules, for instance. I mean, I don't know if anyone's...
We haven't talked about, the potential for on-orbit manufacturing, for example, which is... I wrote down, there's a company that I've spoken to briefly called Axiom, who are one of the many commercial companies. And Axiom are developing modules. Their plan is to build their own space stations. And there was an investment from NASA on four of those technologies, just recently announced, actually. Let me get them right. Which was which considered to be valuable, and so it's called the Focus Area 1A of NASA's research announcement. So one of them was stem cell therapies. So stem cell therapies, and it's all basically because when you're talking about structures, structural biology, crystal structures, semiconductors and so on, then the microgravity environment looks to be potentially extremely interesting, drug development and so on. So one of them was stem cell therapies. That was from the Sinai Regenerative Medicine Institute, Los Angeles. It was a collaboration with them. One of them was fabrication of flawless glass, which is photonics, so optical fibers and so on. So that was number 2. One of them was biometric fabrication of DNA-inspired nanomaterials, so again, the biosciences. And one of them was a semiconductor crystals, so advanced semiconductor manufacture. So those are the 4 areas that they're going to initially investigate in one of their modules. It struck me that those are all areas that the UK is extremely good in. We're excellent in those areas. So then the question arises, given, and we're at the research level at the moment, but it looks likely that microgravity environment will be good for manufacturing ultimately, and certainly research in those areas. Then the question is, again, do we want our own real estate there, or at least real estate that we have a say in, which would be ESA, essentially, because the Italians lead and the French in this. If you look at the construction company for Axiom is the I can never pronounce it right. I'd say Thales in French. It's those companies. It's the European, Italian, French companies that are manufacturing those modules. So I think the question of our strategy is that given that we want to be operating in these areas, do we just rent time, or do we have our own real estate? It's a very central one. Yeah. So, but I think that it relates back to your previous question in a way. I find that obviously students at school are interested in space, but they don't know that space can be biosciences or engineering or communications technology and so on, all those different areas of expertise in the future, and that's not the far future, right? It's just a few years' time, it will have a space component to it. So I always see, it goes back to what I said earlier, I strongly believe that we're talking about an ecosystem when we're talking about space. The space, as I said, the space economy is not really separate from the economy. And the economy relies on this broad ecosystem. And we do have many of the foundations of that ecosystem here in the UK. So the question is perhaps not so difficult to solve the problem of how we can participate more in this multi-trillion-dollar economy, because we've got all the bits. It'd be very difficult if we didn't have all the bits. But it's just joining them up, I think.
Thank you. And the last question, Lord St. John.
Yes, thank you. Professor Cox, you mentioned earlier on about the potential benefits of quantum computing, and clearly its immense processing power allows us to handle complex simulations and complex calculations. I'm wondering to what degree this lead to breakthroughs in cosmology and particle physics. And in terms of what you mentioned earlier on, in terms of, would it give us a better understanding of dark matter and dark holes?
So, it's a great question, because it goes back. I mentioned earlier, so you've given me a reason for elaborating on something I said cryptically earlier, which is that the research into black holes, which was really started, I would say, by questions Stephen Hawking raised in 1973, 1974, ultimately about information and black holes, which became a question of quantum mechanics, quantum information, quantum entanglement, which was very esoteric at the time, and ultimately has become a conversation or an investigation into the structure of space and time themselves, which is your question to cosmology. So one of the views of space and time now, the structure of space and time, is that they emerge from a network of qubits of some sort. So it's almost as if there is a description, well, not almost as if, it is, there may be a description of the universe as a whole, which looks somewhat like a quantum computer, which is underlying the reality that we see, which is not to say that we live in a simulation, just to say that, but it is to say that it looks like there may be a deeper description of our universe. What's really interesting about that is that the skills that you develop as a theoretical physicist, PhD student or postdoc, are the skills you need to work in the quantum computing industry, because many of the challenges are the same. It's about quantum entanglement, which has become it's still a fundamental physics challenge, but it's also an engineering challenge. So it is one of the best examples I know of this ecosystem in action, that we are and have been world leading in fundamental physics, right, for a long time. And so we're producing people that are able to just step into the burgeoning field, as you said, of quantum computing, quantum information, quantum devices. You mentioned dark matter, so there's also which is, I think, ahead of the potential in just general purpose quantum computers, which might be a long way off. But the quantum devices for the detection of things like dark matter, particle detectors, but also when you're talking about detection, you then start to talk about medical imaging and so on. So using quantum devices for those applications is rather closer, I think. And indeed, graphene and those modern materials that we mentioned earlier, they're all inherently quantum devices. You need quantum mechanics to understand how those things operate. So I think it's a great question, and it illustrates that I always see. You mentioned, or someone mentioned earlier, that I was here about 10 years ago talking about funding in science. And of course government, it's relevant in space as well, of course government would like to know, well, where should I invest then to get the best return? It's obviously a sensible question that you have to ask. But I see that, to me, research is, it's almost like you're funding these little ants that are wandering around on the edge of the known and just making little, almost random walks into the unknown. And quite often, or at least sometimes, the little ants stumble across something that is transformative. Quantum mechanics is a good example 100 years ago. And so, but those random walks, I think it's almost impossible to predict which little ant will stumble across the thing that transforms the world. You just have to have as many of them as you can and give them the freedom to wander. Once you've done that, and Andre Geim said this, again in his Nobel lecture, we talked about it earlier in the context of graphene, he said that once you've done it, you have the responsibility and you need the framework to take that knowledge and translate it and make it useful, translate it in something that's useful for the benefit of society. So you have to have both parts of your ecosystem functioning in order to be successful. And so, to summarise it, quantum computing and the skills that we need to take advantage of that potential growth area in the economy are vitally important. But they come ultimately from just making sure the whole ecosystem is healthy.
Thank you. You've been very generous with your time for this public session. So I will, if I may, say formally that the public session is now concluded. Thank you so much, Professor Brian Cox.